I'm going to now share my painting technique for sketch painting with Photoshop. These are 2 quick thumbnails that I did of my dad. I decided that I liked the second sketch more, and from that sketch I ended up with a painterly sketch. I feel that some sketches can be viewed as just a sketch and others more of a final piece of art, and I think it has to do mostly with the artist's style. Not all sketches lend themselves to be labeled as anything other than just a sketch. Now as I zoom in here, you can see some of the detail, and even though I got fairly realistic in certain areas like the eyes and especially the mouth area, I really did keep it sketchy and loose. You can see some of the sketchiness on the neck there, and a lot of people are just, how do you do hair? And they get so caught up with the hair. But really, hair is quite simple for me. I block in the basic shapes in solid shape and value without any individual little hairs. And then I create a small round brush, and I then go crazy on top of it with small teeny little brushes doing my little hairs. It takes patience, but it's not difficult. What you're seeing right now is a dissection of the painting of my dad, just because I want to show you the different steps I took in order to create the painting. And this step right here is the block in. And this step is more of a refined version where I started detailing a little bit more. And as I got to this point, I started feeling like I was losing the likeness and I was losing the humor. My dad's nose is fairly prominent, and even though his cheeks are pushing quite far, I wanted to decrease the size of his cheeks in order to make his nose feel larger. Also, you saw that I circled his forehead. My dad also has quite a forehead, and I wanted to really exaggerate and show the humor in his forehead and also in his fun hairdo. So basically what I did is I decreased the cheek in order to make the nose a little bit larger. The cheek didn't need to be so big, and it also made it a lot more powerful, the humor in his smile. And then the other thing is adjusting the forehead and little adjustments to the mouth. This painting of my dad is a good example of sketch painting, but let me go in a little bit more detail and show you step by step how I do it. I'm going to share with you the brushes and settings that I like to use when sketch painting in Photoshop. These are the same settings I use for my finished work. I prefer to use brush 24 in Photoshop. It's not a brush that I've created, it comes with Photoshop. And I like it because it has a brushy feel and I can get more of a painterly traditional look. You'll notice when I click on the brush that it's solid black. Now if I were to paint with this brush as it is, I wouldn't have any control. It will paint only solid strokes of color. So what I need to do is set my pen pressure so that I have control with my paintbrush. To set the brush so you have control, make sure that Other Dynamics is clicked on. After clicking Other Dynamics, you'll notice that the brush changes from solid black to a softer blend of grays and blacks. Make sure that your opacity jitter is then set to 0% and that the control is set to pen pressure. Make sure that your flow jitter is set to 0% and the control beneath it is set to off. So now you can see the difference when the brush is set to these settings, much more control. I have a black value that I'm painting with, but because of the settings, I can now paint anywhere from a light gray to a dark gray and finally to a black, all with the correct pen pressure settings. The harder I press down, the darker my value, and the lighter that I press down, the lighter my value. I'm going to be doing a black and white value sketch. When I paint with Photoshop, I tend to paint in the same way I would if I were using watercolors. I've got black selected now, but by barely pressing down, I'm going to get a lighter value, like this. If I keep going over it, it will eventually darken. I'm going to make myself a simple value palette. I first select a black from my color picker, then a dark gray, a lighter gray, and then I'll use my eyedrop tool to select white from the background. To use the eyedrop tool while painting with the paintbrush tool, press Alt, and you'll see the eyedrop appear. On a Mac, you'll get the eyedrop tool by pressing the Option button. If I want this gray color, I'll eyedrop it, and now I have the value selected. The same thing goes for selecting other values or colors. So basically, like I said earlier, watercolor techniques come to mind when I think of my digital painting technique. I select a darker value than that of my sphere, and I basically do a wash over the sphere, like how you would with watercolors. If I go over this area again, it's going to get darker. It's all about control and how hard you press down. I eyedrop values within the sphere and begin to blend values together. I'll slowly build up form using darks and lights. Think of it as if you were sculpting. Instead of chipping away to create the form, you're adding correct value and shape to create the form. This is basically how I paint in Photoshop. It's not much more complicated than that. It's more important to keep things simple, especially at the beginning. If I want a little highlight, I'll simply select white for my background. With the white selected, I'll do a light wash. Controlling the pressure of how hard you're pressing down with the white still selected, you can continue to lay down washes of white to again sculpt the sphere. If I were to press down hard, the brushstroke would look solid white. I then select black and paint in a bit more shadow. I then eyedrop that value and continue painting so as to smooth it out a bit. I then continue building up my darks. When I'm painting with Photoshop, I usually prefer to have my opacity set between 85 and 90% and my flow set to 100%, but this all differs depending on the effect I want. This is something that you'll want to mess with until you're comfortable with your own settings. Let me show you a bit of how this brush 24 looks again. I like this brush most because it feels more painterly to me, but I also use rounds from time to time. The first thing I'm going to do to block in this digital painting sketch is I'm going to create a new layer underneath my thumbnail of Dave, and then I'm going to select multiply on the layer of the sketch. This is a quick way to block in shading without losing your line. The next step is I create a new layer on top of my sketch. Now I convert my photo reference to grayscale so when I paint I can focus on the values. I'm also going to mess around with the contrast and boost the contrast a little bit because the photo seemed a little bit flat to me. Then what I do is brighten it up a bit to bring out the detail. But keep in mind, you are the artist. You don't have to paint what you see all the time. There's a lot of things I don't paint exactly the same as the reference. The best way, I guess, to learn how to do this is by painting as much as you can from life. The more you paint from life, the more you'll know how light and shadows work and how they behave in different situations. So now what I do is I fill the layer above my line work with a medium toned gray. I then pull down the opacity a bit so that I can see the line work, but the lines are less harsh. They're no longer solid black lines, but more of a softer gray. This will give the overall piece a nice mid-tone to work with. And I judged my mid-tone by squinting my eyes and looking at the face in the reference photo. The next thing I'm going to do is go to my layer underneath the line work and then select the gray value of the mid-tone and then begin blocking in some of the light shadows. You'll notice that so far all I've used is a large brush. I don't really care so much if I go over the lines, and I don't care if I'm missing any of the details. Just trying to block in the basic form that I'm seeing as I squint my eyes. And that's one thing to keep in mind. Constantly squint your eyes to see the values. Just remember that the details will all come later. Right now what's important is getting the values and getting the shapes that the values are creating. So now I've got a rough block in, and you can see I even painted over the eyes. I don't care about the detail right now. The next step is to make my values a little bit darker and to do some shading in the hat. Now because I'm painting under the layer of gray, it's impossible for me to get too dark right now, which is good. I'm not burdening myself with too many complications. Remember to keep it simple. The next step is to create a new layer above the gray layer and then select that layer to soft light. The reason I select soft light is so that I can control my whites a little bit. I don't want to get too bright, I don't want to have any pure white. I just want something that I can, quickly block in a lighter value with. Something to keep in mind while painting is think of it as if you're sculpting. I feel like I'm pulling the image out of the canvas. I'm slowly building my values up, darks and lights, and eventually the image emerges from the background. Now what I'm doing is putting a little bit of a lighter value on the side of his face to kind of start to pop his face out a little bit. The next step is to create another layer above everything and select multiply. Now the reason I select multiply is so that I can block in some darker shadows and shades of values without losing any of my line work. And then basically what I do is make a few simple passes over some of the areas that I want to darken. Now I'm going to squint my eyes to continue blocking in some basic shape. This is what you should be seeing when you squint. Look at the form in its most basic shapes. The next step is to flatten the image so that it's all on one layer. At this stage, nothing is as dark as it should be, and nothing is as light as it should be. This is where you need to be to start a more detailed painting. Now before I start a painting, I first create a palette, and I do this on a new layer. I first select my darkest dark and put it up here. I then choose a lighter gray that's not too dark, and then another gray of a lighter value. Then a pure white. And because the palette is on a different layer, I can easily just get rid of it later on when the painting's finished. So now that we've finished the block in, we can move on to the next step, which is defining and detailing the sketch a little bit more. And I'm actually going to take this sketch to a more finished piece that I don't really consider a final painting. It's more of a detailed sketch. But the main thing to keep in mind is, and to watch as I continue painting this, is that nothing is changing in my technique at all. I'm still concentrating mainly on values and shape and form. And as I continue to paint, you'll notice that certain things about my original sketch start to really bother me, and I actually paint the mouth away and I repaint it in a different location, and I paint the chin away. So I do a lot of surgery on Dave as I continue painting, and I actually work on the shoulders, and so a lot of things actually change. Even his forehead gets higher, and so this is typical for me when I work on most of my sketches are pretty much in the ballpark of where I want them to be, and usually I discover that once I start painting, even if it's a painting sketch, I'll notice things that are way off. For example, forehead that could be a little bit higher for humor's sake, or just for a stronger likeness. Or I'll notice that maybe one of the eyes was first drawn in a little bit lower than the other eye, so I'll correct that and I'll repaint it higher up. And so you can see as this painting progresses that I do quite a bit to bring it to a place that I'm a lot happier with. nice thing about sketching like this in Photoshop is that you're never finished until you want to be finished. You can keep messing with it, you can keep pushing things and exploring. Well, I don't really like the way that this forehead looks. What differently can I do with it? Or this forehead looks great the way it is, but what would happen if I pushed it just a little bit further this way? So it's a great way to experiment, it's a great way to sketch, and it's a lot easier and quicker to sketch like this than with if you were to sketch with oils or acrylics. It's very easy to make adjustments and changes, and a lot of times I've actually done sketches like this in Photoshop and got it just right to where I'm happy with the way it looks, and then I'll base an oil painting off of this sketch. So really, by the time I get to my oil painting, I've hashed out all my problems and issues, and everything is just ready to go. And then I base my painting off of my Photoshop sketch. Trying to get the likeness with the eyes, especially when you're trying to really capture someone's personality, focus on capturing the negative space in their eye. And what I mean by that is look at the white of a person's eye. Look at the shapes that the whites of the eyes create. Try to capture that shape. If you capture the whites of someone's eyes, you're more than likely going to capture the correct eye shape. And that's one thing that I really focus on. When I'm drawing and painting ears or mouths or noses, I'm not necessarily focused on the fact that I'm drawing an ear or a nose. Something that my dad said to me that stuck with me for all these years is painting a nose is no different than painting water. And what he means by that is painting water and painting a nose, all the same rules apply. You're just looking for shape, you're looking for value, tone, color, temperature, and when it's all done, if done correctly, one will look like water, one will look like a nose. So when I'm painting a nose, I'm focused on not only the nostril, but I'm focused on the negative shapes that are created within that nostril. I'm focused on the negative shapes between the wing of the nose and the crease of the muscles on the face. If you spend your time studying and focusing on these negative shapes, your overall drawing is going to be a lot stronger. An interesting thing about the way that this painting is turning out is if you compare it to what the first sketch looked like, it's much, much different. And it goes to show you that how important thumbnail sketching is. When I did that Dave sketch, I didn't do any thumbnails. I just did a very quick sketch of Dave and began this demonstration. Now, if I were to do a few more thumbnails, I would have came up with a lot more options for me to choose from, and I probably wouldn't have had to go through this whole rigmarole of redrawing his mouth and raising his forehead and doing all these different things to come up with a better likeness. But one never knows what's going to happen while painting. No matter how many times I draw something, no matter how many times I paint, I struggle through every painting. There's always a certain point in a painting where I feel like I'm not sure if this is going to quite turn out the way that I want it to. But I just, you just got to keep going, keep pushing, and don't get discouraged by the mistakes. And speaking of, again, I reworked the mouth because I wasn't quite happy with the mouth. And like I mentioned earlier, the mistake would be to leave it as it was. To continue to develop it and get it to feel just right is obviously the better way to go. Again, the goal is to end up with a successful likeness that's humorous and that really captures the person's character and personality.